Welcome to Shop Talk Live, episode number 309. I am losing my voice. I have a child. Therefore, I have yet another cold. So I'm going to make this short and sweet. This episode is me, Mike, and Anissa, and we talk about a bunch of machinery and fun stuff. And, you know, it's always a good time, especially when Anissa's around. We have fun. If you want to support the show, a Fine Woodworking Unlimited membership is always the best way of doing that. FineWoodworking.com/members. All right, on with the show. So, Anissa, you staged this podcast. You are the keeper of the in-person podcast.
Okay.
I think without you, no in-person podcasts would exist. Yes.
The remote podcasts are so stressful to get set up and make sure there's some section of my house that doesn't have a mound of dirty laundry or clean laundry, rather. Somewhere you just have to push it off. But I had to come here anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm glad it worked out.
Well, you have your broom.
Yep. My little, this is from Rob Spees at Berea College. In the college, the students at the craft school make these and sell them along with a whole bunch of other really beautiful products.
Oh, look at the little tag and everything. Even the branding on it is on point. So tell us about the shoot at Berea, because you came back with like a whole bunch of really cool insights and stories.
The school is, I had heard about the school, and Rob Spees, who has written for us before, he's written, was doing an entryway mirror shelf piece that they produce at the school and sell. It has a round mirror and a couple little drawers and a shelf. He is now, I'm going to get this wrong, so don't quote me, and I'm sorry, Rob. So there's the whole craft school.
Yeah. And
they have broom making, they have a weaving program, a woodworking program, a ceramics program. I'm sure I'm forgetting something. But he runs the woodworking program. He and Larissa Huff were at Lore Woodworking for a long time. And then he went there, and she's doing amazing things where she is in Philly and for us. And, so he runs the woodworking program. The school is, if you are accepted into the school, you don't pay tuition. You do a work study program. A lot of the students will work around the community, which was super cool because the hotel I was staying in had Berea students in it. So, but they also do work programs within the college also. And this history of the free tuition and the work study and the craft program go back a really long time. I don't think that I'm going to do it justice by trying to guess at how long.
Yeah.
But it's steeped in the history of that area in Kentucky, of Appalachia, and just a really cool thing. And they're making beautiful, beautiful work there of all kinds. And this dust broom, they make a little dustpan that goes with it, which they're gorgeous, and they sell them. And they sell, the broom studio was the most beautiful thing because it had all the natural, I think they're harvesting their own straw for the brooms. They're growing it and harvesting it at this point, and they're going out and foraging for some of the broom handles that are really beautiful. I should be going on about the woodworking program too. But
fine broom making.
The brooms were just, even the studio, it's different than a wood studio. You know, you go into the wood studio, which is beautiful there. It's and massive, and they have a great setup. But the broom studio is just quiet, and they're sitting there and they're doing, it's like, it would be a handwork studio for woodworking, the comparison. So, and I bought a broom and I brought it home on the airplane, And as I was walking onto the plane with my broom, because I had to go through security and then I had to walk around for the hour and a half before I got on my flight carrying this broom. And as I walked...
It wasn't this broom.
It wasn't this. It was like an actual broom that I have in my house. But I was trying to board the plane, and the flight attendant stopped me at the door. Did I send you guys photos?
You sent me a photo of like the broom sitting in the airport restaurant.
Oh, right. Yeah, it had breakfast with me. But as I got on the plane, the flight attendant stopped me before I could even get into the plane. And she said, wait a second, I need to take a photo of this. And so I had to pose with my broom. And then she took a photo of the broom in the overhead bin. And I guess she has a Facebook page. It had a really clever name that she just posts the weird things that she sees as a flight attendant.
That would be a good one.
Wow.
Yeah. But if you ever have a chance to visit the area, it's pretty amazing.
But if anyone needs a little dust broom for their shop, which everyone needs.
Yeah.
And you want to like kind of flaunt.
Yeah.
This is the way to go.
Yeah.
So we'll try and post a.
And you can buy their stuff online too.
I was going to say, do they have an online store?
They do.
Yeah.
It's nice to go there if you're in the area because each one is so unique.
Mm-hmm.
They're all handmade by the students, and the colors are different. The different ways that they're attaching and wrapping everything could be different colors or slightly different methods. And the broom handles are all can vary. So it's really cool if you're in the area to be able to go and just choose and look at all of them, but you can get them online. And it looks like it would be clunky in your hand.
No.
And it might not work that well, but it was my first thought. Like, I wonder how well that works. And it seems like it would be very clunky. It's really easy to use and it feels great in your hand and it works really well. I didn't know I would be pitching that when I signed up for
That was good.
Okay. So the other thing, now that we're talking about schools, I wanted to quickly talk or just mention the Wendell Castle workshop is opening up. And I would assume, is it in Rochester? Does anyone know?
I think that area.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because you had mentioned Larissa. I know Larissa's teaching there. Vic is going to be teaching there soon. And just, if anyone is in that area and looking for woodworking classes or whatever, just heads up that now exists. And we're going to try and assemble a post. I know I've said this before, but like of all the woodworking schools and everything. So, we'll just heads up.
Cool.
It is really cool.
All right. Y'all want to answer a question?
Yeah.
Do you have something we're in? All right. Let's see. This question is from John. Thanks for all the great content. As always, I'm having some confusion about planers and planer sleds. I'm hoping you can clear up. I have a DeWalt 735 planer, and it works great. I do not, however, have a jointer, so I've been spending an excessive amount of time flattening boards on the planer sled. That is basically just a piece of MDF. It works fine, but the setup time really adds up. I have kids and a job and very little time in my shop/shed. I was researching other sled designs and came across one that came from Woodsmith Shop, and then there's a link, which I will include. Fine Woodworking also has an article with a similar sled from Keith Rust in October 2005. This sled design uses adjustable cross beams spaced out 4 to 6 inches to support the board from beneath the top. So from beneath the top of the board so that the top of the board can be flattened. My question is, why is the force of the rollers enough to cause snipe at the front of an 8/4 board, but not enough to cause uneven planing in the thinner board on this sled? It seems like if the force of the rollers pushing down is enough to lift the front or back of the board and cause snipe, wouldn't it also be enough to force to deform the board in the unsupported areas between the crossbars and cause uneven cutting across the top? I would expect the board to have waves of high spots and low spots where the crossbars are and are not. And So John is really thinking. This is one of those, like, I always just assumed I understood what was happening. And then he brings it up. It's like, oh, that's a really good question. It doesn't happen, but why?
Well, I think he might be, unless I'm misunderstanding the question. It's hard to read these questions too, because sometimes I'm thinking something that they're not even trying to convey.
Okay.
But I feel as though he's overthinking it maybe, because the snipe isn't so much from everything pushing, it's from the board lifting, not that those spaces that aren't supported underneath. It's like a torsion box almost what he's describing. So what I think he's saying, I could be totally off the mark here, is that why isn't it enough to push down in those sections where it's unsupported, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not why you're getting snipe. You're getting snipe at the ends because the board is lifting.
Yeah, because of a lack of pressure, not too much pressure.
Oh, there's the distinction.
Because you have a feed roller or pressure rollers fore and after the cutter head. So basically the snipe happens either before the leading edge of the board contacts the pressure rollers behind the blade, or once the tailing end clears the pressure roller ahead of the blade, that can lift up. So it's once both of the pressure rollers are engaged, pushing down, it's going to keep everything flat. And, assuming you're not planing 1/4 inch thick stock, which can flex, between those little supports, you're not going to get that deflection. So basically, if people are wondering what a planer sled is, a jointer is really good at getting one face flat, but not necessarily getting the opposite face parallel to that. A planer is really good at getting one face parallel to the opposite face. So if there's a bow or a wave, it's just going to translate that. So the idea of a planer sled is that you're somehow supporting a non-flat surface, either wedging it up. Some people use wedges. Some people use little hot melt glue. I think the key thrust had little things held together with bungee cords or something. So the idea is you're placing a series of supports or wedges so that you're temporarily creating an artificially flat surface by securing a board so it doesn't rock as it's sitting on a flat board beneath it. So like once you clear that in-feed and out-feed, or once both rollers are intact, unless the board is super thin or your supports are really spread out and you have a big arch in the board which is not supported, you're going to get pretty flat. It is cumbersome. I understand not having a joiner is sort of a tough thing, but even if you do have a joiner, it's really good for wide boards. I have a 13-inch planer and I have an 8-inch joiner, and so if I have 12-inch wide boards, sometimes it's worth it to go through that hassle of using that planer sled just to get that first face flat. Otherwise, I'm typically doing a rip in the middle of a wide board, and it's no big deal. You can glue it back up afterwards, but it's kind of nice to avoid it. Or you just come into the shop and
use the 12-inch.
Use a 12-inch joiner. Yeah.
So for me, the thing that is really the difference is that the planer sled is just suspending the piece of wood in a fixed position.
Correct. Yeah.
And then the top of that gets flattened off in relation to the bottom of the sled.
Correct. Yeah. 100%.
Yeah.
So, and one thing that is difficult to wrap your head around, but if you had a piece of wood with a 8-foot radius on it or something like that, and you fed it through a planer, it's still going to have an 8-foot radius.
Yeah, because it will just temporarily flatten that board out. Yes.
Yeah, it will just be of equal thickness the whole way.
Yes.
Now. So I used to, when I was in Nashville, the first time I used a joiner was at the old shop.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Like I was dreamed, and I was like, I'm going to apply for this job, and they have a jointer.
That was a great jointer.
That was a great jointer.
Yeah. I know where it lives too.
Do you?
Yep.
It's at Bob's.
It's at Bob's.
It's in the back room of Bob's.
Oh, is it? Oh, that's what I was thinking. I don't recall seeing it there, but I very rarely go in the back
16
room
inch?
Yeah.
Oof. But the first joiner I used was 16 inches. But I had, I think, like a 2-foot chunk of MDF, maybe 2 pieces of MDF glued up together. Oh no, I made a small little torsion box of MDF and just MDF strips ripped to size. And I would just hot melt glue a piece to the torsion box and run it through my planer. And that was about all I had. And then I always thought, I'm going to make a 4-foot sled and I'm going to make an 8-foot sled. And and the Keith Rust version or the Woodsmith, it's the same concept. But that 18-inch or 24-inch sled was sufficient for 90% of what I did. So I would say don't overthink it when you're building sleds too.
Yeah, and if you want to do that first face by hand, you don't have to get it 100% flat. If you want to pull out a plane and just sort of knock off the high spots so that it's roughly supported flat, that's okay.
What's your go-to when you have a board wider than 8 inches? You mill it here.
No. I mean, I have done that.
You look like there's a confession coming.
There is a confession coming.
Don't tell anyone.
Am I that easy to read?
Well, yeah, there's a look where it's like, I shouldn't say this.
And a pause.
But I'm going to. Well, you asked. I wasn't going to. I must have had the look anyway. And I saw you look at me and you saw anyway.
As she looks away from the judging eyes.
So I have an 8-inch jointer, which is not a lot. And I don't want to dip into the next question. So I'm going to just leave it there. So if on occasions there have been times when I have needed to flatten a board that doesn't fit on there, and I'll just screw it to a piece of plywood, something pretty flat, and I'll go from underneath and make sure that I countersink the screw. And I understand that there are those really narrow screws that have the tiny little, and I don't really care how big the head of the screw is because it's getting countersunk into the plywood.
Like little trim head screws?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, with the little square.
Okay. Yeah.
But the shank of it's really narrow too. So I'll just screw into the board, and if it ends up, it's so small, I can fill it, whatever. So I just screw it in, and then I run it.
That's kind of
through.
genius. You just make sure it's supported by screws.
I make sure that it's supported onto the plywood, and then I just run that through and then unscrew it and flip it and plane it.
Cool.
It feels like such a lazy way to do it, but I only put 2 or 3 depending on how big the board is and how long it is, and it's just I feel so lazy. It seems so lazy, but I don't mind those little holes in there. So
yeah,
it works for me. I've never had a problem like, oh my gosh, there's this big hole and everybody's going to see that there. So whatever.
You're
Oh, I'm sorry.
the table as much as humanly possible.
That's my nervous. People are going to write in and say, what is she, crazy? Why would she do that? All right, I'm going to stop with the pencil. Cross my arms.
All right. So this episode is like machinery themed.
Yeah.
Somehow. I'm trying to be a little bit more timely in getting people's questions answered, though. So this next question is from Nathan.
Were you going to continue with the other John question?
Oh, sure.
I'll continue.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's the part that I didn't want to.
I've also had the same question about jointing a board wider than your joiner by taking the pork chop or the guard off and then putting the flat reference area on a piece of MDF. So basically, you're running a 2-wide board across the joiner. Because the outfeed bed is narrower than the infeed bed, you end up basically And what you want to do is you can only do this once. So you need to set up for a heavier cut, enough to give you a nice bearing surface, but you end up with a board, say a 9-inch board on an 8-inch joiner is going to give you an 8-inch wide, fairly clean area. And then you're going to have this strip of wood outside the cutter head, which is sticking down. And so then you get a piece of MDF. It can be anything, 1/4-inch, 1/2-inch MDF, and just as wide as the jointed portion, shove that there. That little strip is hanging off to the side, and then you can run that through the planer. And then that will give you your flat reference surface, flip it over, and continue planing. So his question is that little flat area off to the side, why isn't that being pushed down? Because it's unsupported by that MDF. So do you want to say why that's okay, or when that's not okay?
You go ahead.
I think there's limits to it working. I would say the maximum width I would do this is, say, a 10-inch board on an 8-inch planer, 8-inch joiner. That would give me a 2-inch little lip unsupported, and I think that's still supported plenty to get flat.
Would you do an 8-inch on a 6-inch jointer?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just where it's a little bit wider than your joiner. You don't want to rip it down to that 8 inches if you need that extra inch or two, and you don't want to go through the hassle of making the whole planer sled with the wedges and stuff. It works really well. So I just have a piece of kind of an 8-inch wide piece of MDF hanging around the shop. But then I always end up cutting it up and using it for something in between. So it feels like I'm always having to make a new one every time I do it. But that works really well.
Yeah, wood is not as flexible as we worry sometimes.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I've seen the take off the pork chop thing guard done, and it works really well. I think you may have showed it to me somewhere. Or we talked about it for an article.
Yeah, I think Tom Begnall did a little short piece on it for an article.
Maybe, yeah. I would end up taking that off, and I would put it somewhere in the shop. It would never go back on.
Nope.
Yeah.
Your joiner guard?
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah. I would do that. I would get bumped into something else.
That was not preceded with a guilty look either.
Wow, that was just like, hey,
here it is.
It would be like 4 years before it got put back on.
Mine is attached by the return spring.
Oh, yeah.
So I pull it off and it just hangs down, but it's there. But in the article that Tom did, we made a little wooden kind of guard that clamps to your vertical fence.
Like a Euro style.
Yeah, that just sits above the blade. Because in the magazine, we can't say, oh, just pull the guard off and don't worry about putting it back on. It's fine. So that's not something. Why is the
Euro guard not like a universal thing, though?
I hate it.
That's why?
I hate it. Yeah, pretty much I hate it.
Mike
says no.
I don't like having to go, then there's a guard, then you kind of have to reach over and can you continue going? I don't know. I'm sure you would get used to it because I know the people who have those, they just, that's fine. But and then also if you're edge jointing, the guard has to be out from the fence that amount. So, I mean, I don't know. Do you like them? You must like them.
They make sense to me.
Okay.
It makes sense to me in the fact that it is not, it's covering the entirety of the pokey bits.
Yeah.
And except when you're edge joining, because it does have to pull away. Now, it does seem like something that when you're edge joining, that Euro guard now has to extend further from the front of the jointer. And it seems like something that you have to like kind of work around, which doesn't seem ideal to me.
Yeah.
The only other guard that I've ever seen that made more sense to me, Michael Cullen has a jointer. Big jointer. I don't know what it is. We'll say 16 inches. But it's, for all intents and purposes, a pork chop style guard that is segmented.
Oh.
So as it moves away from the fence, the section drops down. It's almost like a like a timbre
almost
door.
Like a timbre door that comes down, not
and it drops
out.
and it drops down, and you have nothing to push to walk around.
Right.
Huh.
And it's one of those, this is, why is this not everywhere? Because it's kind of best of both worlds to me. It's always covered. But there's no, like on a wide board with a pork chop thing, you have to be, with a pork chop or a Euro style, I guess, if you're edge joining, you have to be cognizant of this guard is going to move out 8 inches as I push this board through, And it's not that big of a deal, right? But that segmented guard makes so much sense to me.
Yeah.
I want to see that. I don't remember.
We'll have him send a picture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did he bring it east with him?
I think so. Yeah.
The really wide joiner we used to have, that had the pork chop and it slid out. That was a pain because return spring, it kept kind of like staying out. You had to like loosen the knob, push it over, tighten it. It would kind of work. The other thing is that when I'm jointing and I'm milling a lot of stock and I may have to take a couple passes on the joiner, I go all the way across. I just like riding it over the pork chop to shove it back to the infeed side.
Okay.
And on my Delta, the pork chop guard is super sturdy. It's not going to flex down, but on the really wide pork chop, it's kind of, unfortunately, it was made out of like plywood, not metal. But if you kind of did that, it could like pressure down into the cutter. So you had to always be super careful. It's the same thing with that kind of sticky outy guard on the Euro style. Because it's kind of cantilevered out from one end, I think I would have to be careful. I couldn't just ride the stock over that to get back to the.
I've never seen anyone do that before. Huh. Interesting.
Well, if you think about it, in theory, the guard over the table saw blade makes sense, but nobody ever leaves that on. Not that I'm saying you should take off the guard on the jointer, but it was something that you had said about the Euro guard. It makes sense. But yeah, it's a different story than the table saw guard.
Yeah,
for sure.
We trail off into awkward nothingness as we try not to justify
what I just said.
Our habits.
Not everything you think has to actually be voiced.
Since 1928, Woodcraft has been outfitting woodworkers and their shops with everything woodworkers want. Whether you're looking for the world's best tools or the most amazing wood for your next project, Woodcraft has been helping you make wood work for more than 90 years. Visit woodcraft.com or shop at one of their stores. There's more than 70 nationwide. Then, go make something cool. Who wants to go first?
Not it.
Segment potpourri? I got a dumb one.
Okay, you go first then.
It's dumb, but it's kind of clever. All right. I'm going to say it's an all-time favorite technique of all time for this week. In a pinch and minimally, you can use a wheel-style marking gauge as a router plane.
Oh.
Explain.
Very... very thin cuts.
Yeah, just minimally. You're not hogging away anything. But if I would even be willing to say for a hinge mortise, if you want to make sure that, maybe a small box hinge mortise, if you want to make sure that bottom is flat.
So you've maybe already excavated it,
yes.
And then you can go back with your marking.
Yeah.
Like
so
clean up.
Yeah. So if you are lacking for a small router plane to do that last little bit of cleanup, consistent, I want everything here at 2 millimeters thick or deep or whatever. I did it by accident the other day, where I was slotting the sides of an ukulele to recess braces into. And I wound up setting the depth on my little saw, and I did a bunch of cuts to hog away most of it. And then I went to mark the side of the depth, and the depth on my saw were were set up consistently and the marking gauge that were set from both the same gauge. And it was actually just bloop, popped all the pieces right out. And then I was like, wait a minute, this is basically performing the function of a router plane. So as I went through the process with other ones, I just experimented with it. And yeah, you could pull off, that last little bit where I would saw down and chisel out most of the waste. And then I would just take my marking gauge and clear out that last little bit. Now, given this is, a small little teeny tiny bit on an ukulele, but I think this is something that could apply to certain woodworking situations in certain times.
I feel like that's the seed of an idea to invent a new tool.
Like a router plane?
Yeah, like a mini mortise hinge excavator type apparatus.
You need a better name.
And I think it's a good one the way it is.
Now, do you like stop dados on the table saw, and you always have that little scoopy out part, and you kind of chisel the walls, but you need to make sure it's dead flat across the bottom. That could be kind of cool for that.
Yeah, I think it is just for that last little whisper.
Just to really fair it up. Then I was thinking, well, what about a hinge mortise, which is a little bit wider than the head? Then you can get like a piece of 1/4-inch MDF, cut a slot in it, drop the blade through, double stick tape, and now you do have a little mini router plane.
Or even get a piece of 1/4-inch plexiglass.
Okay.
We're riffing.
Yeah.
So.
I've never heard of that. Have you ever heard of that?
No. I think you're onto something.
Sometimes it just takes a dope making a ukulele to stumble upon something. All right.
Cool.
Who's going next?
Me. Because you're going to come up with something super cool. And I don't want to go after that. Not that yours wasn't super cool.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I
need to just
one.
be quiet right now.
No problem going after Ben. Let me follow this one up.
He doesn't sign my expense reports.
I seriously think that it's the seed of a new tool, and somebody's going to watch this and they're going to come up with it. You should 3D print it now. Anyway, so my segment is all-time favorite tool. I think this qualifies as a tool of all time for today or this week or this podcast.
Nailed it.
Yeah. This may not seem as though it pertains, but I did the Philly half marathon in November. And while I was there, I met up with Amanda to just say hi, and we had lunch, and I wanted to check out the shop that she shares with Larissa and Eric and see what they were all working on. So she gave me a tour. We met at her shop, and she gave me a tour of the shop. And I was walking around snooping in everybody's benches, and she was working on her dart cabinet, and she had it all laid out on her bench on a router mat. And I was looking at the router mat. Oh, sorry. I was looking at the router mat, and I said, "Is that a yoga mat?" And she said, "Oh yeah, it's a yoga mat. I got the idea from, I can't remember who she borrowed the idea from. And it's probably old news. You've probably seen this already." And she said, "It works great." As opposed to, because the router mat that I have currently is from 2006, and it was a dedicated, sold as a router mat, but it has gotten so dry and slick. It just doesn't work anymore. And I've been meaning to go to the internet and get the same one, and it was kind of pricey. I don't remember who sold it. But she had the router mat cut, or the yoga mat cut exactly to the size of her bench instead of having it overhanging, and she had leftover pieces from it. So I was in some store somewhere, and I said, "Oh, that's kind of like, it's the same. I never thought about that. It's the same as like the kitchen cabinet rolls of stuff that you can use." And then I was in some box store somewhere, and I saw it's the same material, but it was made for, I think, a kitchen cabinet or something, but it was wider for some reason. And I bought that and it worked great. It's smaller than a yoga mat, so I don't have the leftover pieces, which are ideal for different things, even on a piece of wood instead of cork for sanding. But I've been super happy with it.
So this is not a yoga mat. It's thinner. Is it for lining drawers? But it's not drawer paper. It's got a cushion to it?
It's got a cushion to it, so it's like no stick.
But is it whole like perforated or
it
whatever?
Is,
like
yeah.
a router
Amanda
mat?
had an actual yoga mat.
Yeah.
The one that I got is perforated because it's. I'll have to take a photo. I got 2 of them, and one of them's still rolled up. It has perforations, and it's thicker than the ones that you get for the counter, and it's wider.
Okay.
I'll have to look at what the purpose was for, but I unrolled the one, and I was using it. It works great. Super great.
Cool. It's not like carpet underlayment for...
it might. That is what it might be.
For like the hall rugs so they don't slip around.
It might be.
Oh.
I'll have to look at what the label is, but it's basically all the same product, the same material.
Cool.
And so
I use a yoga mat. And it's like at Sierra Trading Post or whatever.
I know,
I got it for like $5, and it was enough to cover like I have like size to fit. I have like an electronics robot bench that is lined with the yoga mat.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have a yoga mat that is cut to fit my main bench. And then I had enough to have like just like little 10-inch square pieces that I just use for clamping.
Yeah.
Like if I'm putting something delicate in a vise, I wrap that around it. And I did get one that was like a thin layer of cork over the yoga mat. I thought, ooh, it's cork and a yoga mat. But the cork gets like peeled up and bothers me. But.
Yeah. So might not be big news for everybody, but it was for me and really handy.
What's Mike's earth-shattering now that Anissa has set the bar?
No, it's not that great. This could be a really long story. It could be really short. We'd always talked about if you have a workbench and you don't have a vise, or if you have a leg vise and you want to dovetail wide panels and you want more support, the answer is always, well, get a Moxon vise. It's like if you have a leg vise, you probably have a Moxon vise too, because one handles really wide stock. The leg vise does what it does really, really well. But we've done articles on a twin screw vise. Who did that?
You and Matt?
No, like a Moxon vise.
Oh, Mike Farrington.
Mike Farrington did a really good design. In fact, I had it clamped to this bench over here. It's one of those things, you kind of throw this advice out because I have just a regular cast iron vise with a wider jaw, and I can deal with wider boards pretty easily. But I was kind of looking into twin screw vise hardware. And for me, the best twin screw vise hardware came from Lee Nielsen. They used to sell just the hardware alone if you wanted to make your own vises. Now, I think because of shortage of everything during COVID and stuff, the only way you can get the Lee Nielsen twin screw vise hardware is on their workbenches, which is cool.
It's free. The vise is $3,000 and it comes with a free bench.
However, there is one other option I stumbled on. Lee Nielsen sells basically a Moxon vise with their twin screw chain hardware. So it keeps the jaw nice and parallel. And I thought, well, this is the only way I can get a hold of this hardware short of buying a whole workbench. Let me just buy one of these things right now. And it was actually less expensive than other just hardware kits out there from other manufacturers. So I thought, that's okay. So I bought this thing kind of on a whim. I really didn't need it. So it really stuck. It was just living underneath my bench for a long time because it's really heavy. And it's cumbersome, and it takes up kind of half my bench once I do pull it out and clamp it in place. But I think I was working on some wider stock for some reason. And so I eventually pulled it out, clamped it to my bench top, was using that. And it worked really, really well. It was like really nice. It kind of stayed clamped to my bench much longer than I expected it to, because I have two workbench. My outfeed table is equipped with a vise, so that acts as a secondary workbench. So it wasn't like I had this thing, my workbench completely taken up by this twin screw vise because I had another thing to work. And it was kind of like, oh, that would be kind of cool to have this all the time. It was wide between centers. I think it was like 18 inches between centers. So the overall vise was like 2 feet long or something. And I think if I were going to do like a twin screw vise on my workbench, I think you have the option of getting 12 inches between centers. And I think that's enough for pretty decent capacity, and also keeps that vise jaw from being too long. Because I have a small shop. My workbench is only like 5 feet long. I think if I had a 7 foot long workbench, it would be less of an issue. But anyway, so favorite tool of all time for the last couple weeks has been something that I've recommended to other people without ever actually taking advantage of myself. So, yeah. And so we mentioned Mike Farrington had come up with a Moxon Vice article for us that just used kind of off the rack, hardware, much cheaper, much less expensive to get going. And I had that clamped to the workbench in here, giving that a go. And it's like, oh, that works out pretty well too. So I recommend it if you have either small vise or a leg vise, or you're looking to do wider dovetailing. So what it's really good for is if you're working on the end of a wide board held vertically, which in essence is dovetails for the most part. Especially if you're making your own, it's not that big of a deal. It's pretty inexpensive. And if you want to splurge and get, Lee Nielsen twin screw Moxon vise, that's awesome too. So it's one of those things. I talked to Bob Van Dyke. He has a tail vise on his bench. And we were talking about bench designs and what you're going to make. And he says any bench has to have a tail vise. And my point of view is like, no, it doesn't, because I don't have one and I don't miss it. And he has one, and he says it would just be horrible to not have a tail vise. And that kind of comes to you get accustomed to what you have. You work around the capacities of what you have. So yeah, if you have a super nice tail vise, you're going to miss it if you don't have one. And if you don't have a tail vise, you're going to figure out how to do things and not miss it because you don't really understand the capability, or you don't depend on that to do a lot of things. So it's this weird thing. So I don't know.
Chris Gochner was like the example for me that was like, oh, he needs a tail vise, because the way he cuts tenons by hand, it's like he holds it in the tail vise a very particular way, and then he flips it around, and it was all dependent on having the tail vise. And even to the point where I feel like his tool selection is informed by him having a tail vise. Not many people, we always get the question, is like, is a skew rabbet block plane worth having? And it's always like, yeah, they're great, but most people don't find much of a use for them. Whereas Chris Gochner, since he can hold the thing perfectly straight up and sight down it, he's using that all the time for facing his tenons. And it's just like, oh, his choice of the skew rabbet block plane is informed by him having a tail vise and it being a part of what he does all the time.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's that whole argument. Oh, you need this. No, you don't.
Yeah.
Or you don't need this. It's like, well,
you need a 1/2-inch chisel.
Maybe. Well, yes. Let's start there.
But there's a workaround for whatever situation you're in.
Yeah.
As long as you have a 1/2-inch chisel.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking. I just didn't say it out loud.
So a lot of times you get the question, hey, do I need such and such tool? And if I don't have it, I don't say, no, you don't need it. I say, I don't have one and I can get by without it. I imagine if I had it and got to use it for what it's used for, I would probably use it more often. Like I've never had a router plane forever, ever, ever, and did not miss it until on a whim I bought a router plane, started using it, and now I really like a router plane. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
All right. Should we go to the Unisaw question?
Yeah.
This question is from Nathan. I need some motivation. I was recently gifted an old 1974 Rockwell Delta Unisaw with a 3 horsepower motor. Good to be Nathan. The saw needs some electrical work, and I'll probably tune it up while I'm at it. I have to rewire my workshop with 240 volt power to run it, and then I'll have to rearrange all the tools in my small 12x16 workshop because the Unisaw is much larger than my current vintage Craftsman contractor saw. I know how to do all this work, but I predict about halfway through I'll be questioning whether it's worth all of the effort to upgrade my table saw. Can you talk about how wonderful a Unisaw or other comparable cabinet saws are? I'm guessing that by the time this episode of the podcast comes out, I'll be about halfway through the project, and your advice will be just the motivation I need to finish the project. Thanks in advance. So, we have both had a Unisaw, the same Unisaw.
Same one.
Yeah.
I would say it's not so much the Unisaw, which is a great saw. I think having 220 power to your shop, that's a game changer.
Okay.
Because you can get by without 220. You can buy like the 1 3/4 horse saw stop, which is a wonderful saw and do everything you want to. But with 220, you can get a 3 horse saw. You can get a bigger bandsaw. You can get, so my bandsaw, my joiner, my planer, and my table saw all operate on 220. Yes. And I wish I had a second 220 line because I would upgrade my dust collector for 220 as well. It's just it's going to have a pretty big trickle-down effect on your future purchases. So that's a cool thing. And so then, the question between a Unisaw and a contractor saw, I think it has less to do about power than it has to do with just stability, mass, accuracy in terms of the fence, lack of vibration in terms of the motor. I think you're going to get truer cuts. And I think you go from a saw, which is kind of a rough dimensioning tool, to a saw, which is a fine dimensioning, fine joinery tool. So I think the Unisaw is that's a huge investment, and it's going to change the way you approach your table saw if owning that table saw over a contractor saw or a job site saw.
Yeah, I agree with everything Mike said, especially the when he talked about going from the contractor saw, just the stability and the vibration. But additionally, I was thinking about this in terms of a meeting that we had yesterday where we were all in a meeting and Asa was talking about his bandsaw. And he had to help me out here. What was
replace the capacitor?
He replaced the capacitor, and he was talking to us about it, and how he wasn't sure. Should I do this? He did end up talking about getting the fire extinguisher out when he finally plugged the thing in and turned it on. But the satisfaction that dude got from taking on that project and fixing that machine by himself, and then turning it on and having it successful and not having to use the fire extinguisher. He was so proud of the work that he had done repairing that machine instead of, buying a new one or having somebody else come and do it. I think that, in addition to everything Mike said, is going to be such a huge boost for Nathan to make it through rehabbing that machine, changing the wiring if he needs to, and just using it. And it's a great saw.
Yeah.
So I think you have to add that factor into the end product.
I don't think I necessarily calculated in that he is upgrading his whole shop, or potential for the shop. Like you said, when you run in 220, just everything gets becomes a possibility.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I have a caveat that 74, I don't know what kind of fence would be on a Unisaw. If it was the stock fence, and it was like the pipe.
Did he say he had a Unisaw 3 horsepower?
Can you move your phone?
Maybe it was a different question where someone had the Unisaw with a Unifence, which is super cool. The Jetlock is the horrible fence everything came with up until they converted to a Biesmeyer style fence. Yeah. Bottom line, if it's that weird looking old style with the round bars, take it off, put a piece of my fence on there.
Yeah. So like if that is a financial hardship, you need to calculate that into
The price of
the
the
price of the transition.
Right. Yeah.
You got a free unisaw, so you're ahead of the game. One thing that's so great about woodworking machines is there's really not that much to them. It's like an arbor with a belt going to a motor. Right?
Yeah.
So if you are pulling apart the unisaw and setting it up or whatever, I would replace the bearings unless you know that they've been replaced in the last 10 years, right? But you might as well just do it. It's not a difficult task. So it's like you've got two bearings in the arbor, whatever, new belts.
Yeah.
Set the saw up, but make sure, like, I think if you go through all of that trouble and then you have a cruddy fence, you're going to be like, this wasn't worth it. Why did I do all that?
Right.
You know? So that's part of the calculation for me. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Yeah. That whole sort of analog aspect of older machines, like I love my saw stop. I don't regret getting it. It's great to have, but the little computer electronics just freak me out because it's like you go to turn on your saw and if something glitches out and it doesn't turn on, it's like I'm kind of lost.
I have a hard time with it in a tool that is not going to save an amputation. Like a drill press with a bunch of electronics to me is kind of
I see
like,
what you're
right.
saying.
Yes.
I don't necessarily see the upside for the limited lifetime of this thing.
Yeah.
You know, whereas a saw stop, it's like, you know what, even if like 20 years down the road, you need to get a new central processing unit for your table saw, it's like, well,
Yes.
the cost was worth it, you know? So,
Yeah. And that's it. I've had my saw stop for a number of years. I'd say it gets not like commercial shop heavy use, but I think it gets pretty consistent use. If I'm prepping, you know, I'm using it for probably 3 or 4 hours a day, you know, over the course of a day. So it gets a lot of use. I've had no problems with it. And just in terms of the quality of the saw itself, it's great. And you're not going to cut your finger off.
Now, the flip side of the coin is that you didn't upgrade because of the quality of a unisaw versus a saw stop. You upgraded because you were prepping for classes and finding yourself in a more of a production state. And that is when you know that stuff goes wrong.
Yeah. If I weren't teaching or prepping, I would still have the unisaw.
Yeah.
Because if you think about in the course of building a piece of furniture, solid woods, you know, the amount of time spent at the table saw is pretty small.
Yeah.
And also a lot of that time at the table saw when it gets down to joinery using crosscut sleds and methods that I think are incredibly safe and not an issue. So, yeah. But I wouldn't have switched to a saw stop if I had to compromise on the quality of the saw itself. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one of those, if you can swing it, it's a no-brainer. And maybe years from now when somebody listens to this episode, there's going to be other options out there. So,
well,
and the flesh sensing technology, however you want to package it, is.
That said, prior to the saw stop coming out, trying to find an old unisaw, used unisaw to buy, that was like the holy grail. You never saw them because people had them. Why would I get rid of this? And now they're super cheap.
The market goes up and down.
Does it?
Actually, I did pretty all right with that unisaw.
I didn't.
Yeah, because there was drywall dust in it. All right, let's try and hit one of these last ones real quick. Do we want to talk about moving machines or do we want to talk about special boards, special pine boards?
We did a lot of machine talk.
Let's do the boards.
Right.
That's kind of cool.
All right, this last question is from Andrew, and he used EWP, and it took me a long time to figure out what he was talking about. I I try not to be precious with wood and not save special boards, but instead find a good use for them. I purchased a wide single piece of Eastern white pine, right? Can we agree on this?
Yeah.
From the estate of a local woodworker. It is 38 inches by 19 inches, 1 inch thick. Not really big enough for a whole project. And since it's Eastern white pine, not really super exciting grain that would make a special pop, or that would make a project pop. But it is beautiful, almost 100% quarter sawn and completely clear. It is, in its own way, in its own special way, it is unique and reminds me of some of the stuff you see on antique furniture when the top was a single wide plank. But for the life of me, I can't think of a project that would make good use of it without cutting it up. My latest idea would be something shaker, where the simplicity would showcase the pine, but dimensions kind of throw me off. Any suggestions would be appreciated. So 38 inches, so it's not super long. 19 inches wide, though.
Yeah. What are you going to do with that?
Well, I thought about this, and he kind of has the answer already in there. He talked about it being something shaker and probably a top. And if that's the first thing that he's thinking of when he's seeing this board, I would kind of go with that. And I would, if he gets the Cassé book or a look at that and just kind of looks through that Cassé book of shaker furniture, he'll see so many projects that have just a nice clean top right around that size, or maybe a little bit smaller that he could cut it down. And he can make a lot of case pieces in there. Some of the smaller projects. Cherry's a really great wood with pine.
Yeah.
I could see that happening.
Would you do a cherry case and a pine top?
I would.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah, I would. Maybe even a cherry case with a pine top and pine drawer fronts, or I would. So I think he's already halfway to feeling what he wants to do with that piece already. And I think he just needs to kind of look at some, I don't have a specific piece that I'm thinking of, but even as I'm talking about it now, a bunch of them are flashing in.
What's the little shaker book of furniture? It's like 3 separate books.
Yeah.
Because Cassé is kind of hard to find and expensive.
Yeah.
And these other ones are like,
basically shop drawing plans for pieces, which it's a really, really good set of books.
That's a great idea.
Elger, someone.
Okay, we'll look and
I have
I will
one or two
certainly
of
try
them.
and remember it.
Okay. Well, I think that's great. I think there's another way to go with this. I think you're sort of stuck on the aspect that this is a big wide board, and that's kind of a nice thing. But the other way to look at it is, I think for me, the ideal thing is to make a project using wood from the same tree for all the parts. Another way to think about that is to make a project where all the wood comes from the same initial board, which you've got here. And Eastern white pine, if it's quarter sawn, it's pretty old. It's probably super stable. And so you have a lot of lumber here, especially if you're resawing that into, half-inch thick pieces or quarter-inch thick pieces. You can build some really exquisite small projects from this. And I think Chris Bexford is a perfect resource for that. He's done a number of small projects in pine, hanging cupboards. He did a shaker lap desk.
Yeah.
Which would be fantastic.
Oh, you could probably get that out of that.
Yeah, because it's all super thin stock.
Yeah.
You could do...
Even if you had a second board for the bottom, that'd be
Yeah.
fine.
You could do a small dovetail chest.
Yeah, he has that little chest with the side drawer that comes out of it and the top flips up.
Yeah, and then just sort of size the proportions of the piece on your yield. So like this, you can probably get the top and the sides out of this. And so you have a secondary wood for the bottom or whatever. But I would see it's the equivalent of taking a really, really nice exotic board, cutting it into veneers, and then facing all the parts of a larger piece with veneers from the same flitch. This is just, you'll have plenty of solid wood. And I think that's, I would do that.
Yeah. The only thing that those dimensions that popped out to me, if you want to keep the board intact, it would be a sideboard, like the top of a sideboard.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, because 38 inches, that's actually pretty. That's over 3 feet. That's a cool little sideboard. Yeah.
Yeah. Shaker.
You could cut, I think I calculated 1,200 Kumiko strips out of that board.
Some people think imperial, some metric. Mike thinks Kumiko strips.
Yes.
How many Kumiko strips can I get? We're gonna sneak one more in. Sorry. David asks, basically he moving shop has a budget and space and is wondering the best way of moving things like a large saw stop, 8-inch jointer, 12-inch jointer planer combo, larger bandsaw. They weigh a lot. Typically, I'm seeing 400 to 500 pounds. I can get tools delivered to be inside my garage, but uncrating and placing them on roller stands is an issue, except for the saw stop cabinet saw. The product manuals I have found online mostly call for using a forklift to get pieces off the crates and setting them up. Is it typical for a hobbyist to rent a forklift when buying this larger machinery? Are there other safe methods you have used that do not require a small army of young people with strong backs? So, if you're really worried about it, I mean, so we use the pallet jack here, but I've seen so many people do so much heavy lifting with an engine stand, or not an engine hoist. So I think you could go down to Harbor Freight for like, $150 or something and get an engine hoist, and that will lift any of these things.
Okay. I firm believer in the young, strong backs. And that doesn't necessarily mean neighbors or family members if there isn't anybody around. You're going to pay for it either way. So it's either through beers and pizzas for people you know, or find any local movers, get a couple guys over to do all that lifting. It may cost you, a couple $100 in an afternoon to do that. If you can find a local machine place that sells this stuff and will also include delivery and setup in their prices, you're going to pay a premium for that as well, but you're going to get it where it needs to go, and they're going to guarantee that it's set up and running well. Again, those resources might be hit and miss depending on where you're at, but get some help, because once it's where you want it, it's a wonderful thing to have. And I think the main reason I'm not interested in selling my house is because I would have to move all of my machinery into a new shop. And I would figure out a way to do it without taxing my back and still not being close to getting things where they need to go.
Yeah.
The only time I've ever dealt with moving machines that really required the pallet jack or an apparatus, a hydraulic thing, there was that robust lathe that Chris and I had to get back on the pallet to ship back to them.
Oh, yeah.
That was a thing. Because getting something...
I was here for that. It was the three of us.
No, it was just me and Chris. But I think you moved it once it was... But getting it on the pallet was like, how do we do that? Like, getting something off of a pallet is not that big of a deal most of the time. The only time...
Oh, no. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Doesn't matter.
The only time that I've ever had like the head scratcher, how do we get this off the thing, is that 12-inch joiner was on an exceptionally high, like, wheeled pallet from the mill workshop next door.
Okay.
And it was like a 10-inch tall thing. And it was me and Chris, who was writing that article on moving big machines, and Barry just sitting there like, how do we jack this up in order to get the thing? Because all of it had to happen at once, it seemed like. But generally, using enough pieces of 2x4s and 4x4s, you can get something up high enough to therefore get the pallet out from under it. So if you can do some rigging to get like solid wood pieces under some car jacks, you can lift the machine up And then you slowly, so you need 2 car jacks and 2, like they move a house though, and 2 sets of rigging, whatever they call those wood, beds that, you stack up. But overdo it, just move it 1.5 inches at a time up and move it 1.5 inches at a time down. So you're lifting the whole thing up outside of the pallet, and then you get the pallet out from under it, you put the mobile base down under it, and then you slowly lower it, 2 car jacks, 1 on each side, and you just move it this side, that side, this side, that side. You can do anything that way. It's going to take a long time, and you need to be super, super patient and just accept in your being that you are going to cut up 10 2x4s that, will just be 24 inches long and just sit there for padding or rigging that up. That's how we got that joiner off. That's what we wound up doing with that lathe, getting it back on the pallet, where we basically had to suspend the lathe above everything and then move the pallet under it so we can then lower it. But if you're not dealing with a 12-inch, that is a beast of a joiner over there. That's everything else, a few strong backs and some.
Yeah. Well, we did that article. It was based on the idea that, I'm going to step up to a new machine. This is great. And then suddenly you're faced with this crate in the middle of your driveway. It's like,
or at the end of your driveway. Yeah.
Or even in the middle of your shop. What do I do? So the idea is to take you from that delivery point to get your machine up and running. And there are some really good tips in there for getting it where you want it before you uncrate it, doing the degreasing, doing kind of some overview of machine setup, all that good kind of stuff. But one of the huge takeaways is get help when you're lifting heavy stuff. Yeah.
And disassemble it as much as you can.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you're going to take the joiner beds off, because you gotta line them up. Nothing is precious here.
Right.
Disassemble it, make it as light as humanly possible, move it, get it on the mobile base, and then put it back together, because you're setting it up anyways.
Yeah.
Give yourself a day per machine to set these things up. Give yourself a day per machine to move it if you got it.
Right. And it's a good investment to make. You'll be happy.
Well, that does it for this episode of Shop Talk Live. If you have any questions you'd like answered on the show, please send them into shoptalk@taunton.com. If you have a 5-star review you want to share with the world, please jump onto iTunes and give us that 5-star review. It really does help. And click that thumbs up button if you're watching on YouTube. We will be back with another episode in 2 weeks. Have fun, y'all.